My name is Claire, and I live alone in a 2-story house. I always found it a cozy place, perfect for working and relaxing without distractions. But a few weeks ago, I started noticing things that made me question my safety, and maybe even my sanity. It all started subtly. Small noises upstairs when I was downstairs. I thought it was just the normal sound of an old house, the kind of noise that no one notices until they start paying attention. But that night, the sound became impossible to ignore. It was around 10 p.m. and I was in the kitchen washing the dishes after dinner. The TV in the living room was on, but the volume was low. It was then that I heard the first sound. Steps, slow and heavy, as if someone were walking down the hallway upstairs. I stood still, holding a soapy plate, trying to hear better. My first thought was that maybe I had left a window open and the wind was blowing something around, but the footsteps continued. I left the tap running and walked to the stairs, trying not to make any noise. I climbed a few steps, my heart racing, and called, "Is anyone there?" Silence. When I reached the top of the stairs, the hallway was empty. All the doors were closed, just as I had left them. I went back to the kitchen, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. 2 hours later, I was already in bed, ready to sleep, when the sound returned. This time it was louder, hurrying footsteps as if someone was running back and forth upstairs. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. It was impossible to ignore now. I picked up my cell phone and called the police, but before they could answer, the call disconnected. Then something new happened. A low, almost imperceptible sound began to echo through the house. It was like a whisper, incomprehensible words, but definitely a voice. I turned off the light in the room and locked the door, trying to control my breathing. It was then that I heard the door handle slowly turn. "Who's there?" I shouted. On the other side, absolute silence. I gathered my courage and opened the door with force, illuminating the hallway with my cell phone's flashlight. There was no one there. But as I illuminated the floor, I saw something that made me freeze. Wet footprints led from the stairs to my bedroom door. I went back inside and locked the door again. I tried to call someone, but the cell phone still had no signal. The only thing that accompanied me that night was the sound of footsteps that, once again, began to circulate upstairs. That's when I noticed something that made me feel even worse. The footsteps were no longer above me. They were on the same floor. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the room, with the kitchen knife I had brought with me. When the sun finally rose, I found the courage to go out. The house was silent, but there was something that wasn't there before. On the hallway mirror, written with a dark substance, was a sentence. "Do you hear me now?" Since then, I have never slept in that house again. My name is Annie, and I live alone in a small house inherited from my grandparents. I've always been a calm person, and living alone has never been a problem. Until that night. The house has a basement, which I always avoided because of the dust and damp smell. There was never any reason to go in there, as most of the things stored down there were old antiques that no one wanted. It was a Thursday, and I was alone at home as usual. The night was silent until I heard something unusual, a sound coming from the basement. It was a repetitive ringing, as if someone was lightly knocking on the door leading downstairs. My first reaction was to think it was just the wind or some animal. But as I approached the door, I realized the sound was rhythmic, light tapping followed by short breaks. I opened the door carefully and turned on the stair light. The hallway leading down to the basement was empty, but the sound seemed to be coming from below, deeper, almost muffled. "Is there anyone there?" My voice echoed. The sound stopped. I quickly closed the door, locked it, and walked back into the living room, trying to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Later that night, while watching TV, I heard another sound. This time there were no knocks. It was the sound of something dragging across the floor like furniture being moved. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the basement door again. I placed my ear against the wood, trying to identify the sound. It felt like something heavy was being moved down there. I didn't know what to expect, but I decided to open the door again. I went down the stairs carefully, lighting the way with my flashlight. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the musty smell was even stronger, and the air felt colder. The basement was as I remembered, boxes stacked up, old furniture covered with sheets, and a dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling. But something was out of place. In the center of the basement, one of the chairs that had been covered with a sheet was now facing the stairs, as if someone had sat there. As I inspected the place, I felt a chill creeping up my spine. I looked back and saw that the basement door, which I had left open, was now closed. I ran to the stairs, but no matter how hard I pulled, the door wouldn't budge. I began to hear a low, constant sound, as if someone was whispering words I couldn't understand. Suddenly, the lamp started to blink. In the corner of the basement, something caught my attention, a shadow that shouldn't be there. It was humanoid but crooked with sudden movements. The shadow seemed to slowly approach, even though I didn't see anyone around. The light from the lamp flickered again, and for a moment I saw something that made me freeze. A tall, hunched figure with pale skin and shining eyes. She was staring at me. I ran up the stairs, knocking loudly on the door. I screamed, begging him to open up. The sound of banging in the basement began again, but now it was deafening. Finally, the door gave way, and I stumbled out, slamming it shut and locking it again. I spent the rest of the night in the living room with all the lights on, trying to understand what had happened. The next morning, I called a friend to help check the basement. When we opened the door, everything was normal. No chairs out of place, no strange shadows. But on the floor, in the center of the basement, there was a single mark, as if someone had scratched the concrete with long fingernails. My name is Mary, and 6 months ago I moved into a small apartment in the city center. I've always loved living alone, but since that night, my relationship with silence and solitude has never been the same. It was an ordinary Friday. After a long day at work, I made dinner, watched a series, and around 11 p.m. decided to take a shower before bed. My peaceful routine was interrupted when I noticed something strange. When I entered the bathroom, the air felt colder than normal, as if a window was open. I looked around. Everything looked in place, but the mirror was fogged up even though the shower wasn't on. In the center of the fogged glass, there was a mark, a small, thin hand, as if someone had pressed it against the mirror. I thought that was strange, but decided to ignore it. It was my biggest mistake. After showering, I went to the bedroom and started getting ready for bed. As I brushed my hair in front of the wardrobe mirror, I felt something strange. The reflection felt wrong. I was brushing my hair with my right hand, but in the mirror, my left hand appeared to be doing the movement. I stopped for a moment, frowning, and the reflection stopped too. I took a step back, trying to convince myself that I was tired, but when I turned to leave, the reflection didn't follow me. My body froze. The me in the mirror was staring at me with a blank expression, eyes fixed, as if waiting for something. I turned off the bedroom light and ran into the living room, trying to calm my racing heart. I sat on the couch and turned on the TV, but I could barely pay attention to what was on. That's when I heard it. Steps, slowly, coming from the corridor that led to the room. At first I thought they were echoes from my already terrified mind, but the footsteps continued louder and closer. I took out my cell phone and turned on the flashlight, illuminating the hallway. It was empty. I went back to the living room, but the noise started again, this time closer, as if something was dragging its feet across the floor. When I looked at the living room window, I saw something that made my stomach turn. The reflection of the hallway in the window showed a slowly moving shadow, but when I looked directly into the hallway, there was nothing there. My breathing was heavy and my hands were shaking as I tried to call the police. But the call didn't go through. The cell phone screen flickered, and then a message appeared, even though I hadn't received any notification. "Why are you running away from yourself?" I dropped my cell phone and ran to the front door, trying to open it, but the lock seemed to be stuck. It was then that I heard the voice. It was faint and distorted, but clearly my own voice. "You can't leave. This is yours now." I returned to the living room, and the environment seemed colder. The mirror on the closet in the living room was now fogged up, like the one in the bathroom before. As I got closer, I saw something written on the glass. "Look at me." I got closer, even though every instinct told me to run. My reflection was there, but it wasn't mine. She smiled in a way I never would, with her lips stretched too far, and then raised her hand to touch the glass. Before I could react, I felt something cold touch my shoulder. I quickly turned around, but there was no one there. When I looked back in the mirror, the reflection was empty. The next morning, I went to sleep at a friend's house and decided never to go back to the apartment. A week later, I received a call from the landlord saying another tenant had moved out. But what he told me afterwards made me freeze. The new tenant complained about hearing footsteps at night and said that sometimes he saw someone in the mirror who wasn't him. My name is Rian, and I live alone in a small house in the suburbs. I've always found it reassuring to have my own space, away from the noise and hustle and bustle of the city. It was the kind of place where people only locked their doors out of habit, not out of fear. But that night I realized that even the safest places can become terrifying. It was raining heavily, and I was in the kitchen making a sandwich before bed. Water ran down the windows and the sound of rain filled the house. As I turned to get a glass from the cupboard, I heard something. It wasn't the sound of rain or wind. It was different. It was the sound of footsteps. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was just the heavy drops hitting the porch. But when the sound repeated, I realized it was coming from inside the house. I took out my cell phone and turned on the flashlight, illuminating the rooms as I went. The room was empty, as was the hallway that led to the bedrooms. Even so, the footsteps continued. They were slow, almost calculated, as if someone were pacing from one side to the other. When I got to the room, everything seemed normal. The window was closed, and the wind outside was the only thing audible. I tried to convince myself that it was my imagination, but when I turned to leave, something caught my attention. There were drops of water on the floor, forming a trail that led from the room to the hallway. I followed the marks, which ended at the back door of the house. The door was locked, but outside there were wet footprints. They looked like bare feet, but were larger than normal. What made me freeze was the fact that the footprints didn't go all the way to the door. They came from inside the house, heading outside. I walked away, trying to understand what was happening, when I heard a loud sound coming from the room. The door slammed hard. I ran over there, but when I tried to open it, it was locked. On the other side, I heard the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I really was. The sound stopped. I took a screwdriver and forced the handle until I could open the door. The room was empty, but something was out of place. On the closet mirror, there was a mark. It wasn't a hand, but something long and thin, like claws. Before I could react, all the lights in the house went out, leaving only the sound of rain and my own breathing. I picked up my cell phone to call the police, but the signal was dead. It was then that I heard a knock on the front door. No, no, no. I ran there, but didn't open it. I looked out the next window, trying to see who was knocking. The rain made it difficult to see, but I could make out a figure standing on the porch. She was tall and completely still, with her face turned towards the door. It wasn't human. My heart skipped a beat as the figure slowly leaned over to look out the window. Before I could see her clearly, I backed away and ran into the bedroom, locking the door. The knocking began again, this time louder, echoing throughout the house. Suddenly, the sound stopped. And then, something started knocking on the bedroom window. I turned around slowly, and what I saw still torments me. On the glass, a hand was pressed, but it was pale and deformed, with long fingers that looked unnatural. The figure stood outside, looking at me with dark, empty eyes. I was frozen for a moment, but then I heard his voice, low and slurred. "You forgot to lock the door." Before he could react, the lights came back on and the figure disappeared. The next morning, I told the police what happened, but they found no footprints or signs of a break-in. Since then, I check all doors and windows at least 3 times before bed. But sometimes when it's raining at night, I hear footsteps in the hallway and I wonder, did I lock the door? My name is Daniel, and this story happened 2 months ago. I live alone in a small apartment in the city center. I like the tranquility and silence, especially at night when I can relax after a long day of work. That night, everything started as usual. I made dinner, put a movie on TV, and stayed on the couch until sleep started to hit me. That's when I received the first message. My cell phone vibrated on the table next to me, and when I picked it up, I saw that it was from an unknown number. The message read, "Are you home alone?" I thought it was a mistake or some bad joke. I responded with just a question mark, but got no response. I turned off the light in the living room and went to the bedroom, trying to forget. I didn't know that was just the beginning. Around midnight, I was woken up by a sound coming from the living room. It was low, as if something had fallen. I got up slowly and went to check. Nothing seemed out of place. The TV was off, the chairs were in their normal position, and the balcony door was still locked. However, my cell phone was on the floor as if it had fallen off the table. When I picked it up, I saw another message from the same number. "Why are you awake?" My body froze. I looked around, trying to find some explanation. The living room window was closed, but I could feel the air around me grow colder. I texted back, "Who are you?" Seconds later came the answer, "I'm in." I ran to the front door, but it was still locked with all the chains in place. I checked all the windows again, but they were intact. My apartment was small, and there was nowhere anyone could hide. I tried calling the police, but my cell phone didn't work. There was no signal, which was impossible since I lived in the city center. That's when I heard the sound. Footsteps, slow and shuffling, coming from the hallway that led to my room. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and walked slowly to the hallway. The light was off, but I managed to see something through the reflection of the cell phone's flashlight. On the floor there were marks, like wet footprints, that weren't there before. The marks went all the way to my bedroom door. The sound stopped. The door was ajar, and inside there seemed to be a shadow cast on the wall. With the knife in one hand and the cell phone in the other, I slowly pushed the door open. My room was empty, but the window was open, even though I was sure I had closed it. Before I could process what was happening, my phone vibrated again. "Don't try to see me." Desperate, I started closing all the windows and doors, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Every shadow seemed to be moving, every sound seemed louder. Finally, I locked myself in the bathroom, trying to catch my breath. My cell phone vibrated once again. "Why are you hiding? I already found you." The bathroom light started flickering. When I looked in the mirror, I saw something behind me. A tall, motionless shadow with glowing eyes that shouldn't be there. I turned around quickly, but the bathroom was empty. When I looked in the mirror again, the figure was gone. That night, I didn't sleep. When the sun finally rose, I ran out of the apartment and went to a friend's house. When I returned the next day, I found my cell phone on the living room table with one last message: "I'll be back when it gets dark." I still live in the same apartment, but I've never been alone at night again.